Guten Abend, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren. Ich begrüße Sie ganz herzlich am Institut für Sozialforschung. Mein Name ist Clara Meyer. Ich bin Wissenschaftlerin hier in der Forschungsgruppe für Demokratie und Staatlichkeit und werde Sie heute etwas durch den Abend führen. Jetzt würde ich aber ins Englische wechseln. Wie Sie wissen, ist der Vortrag auch auf Englisch und insofern sollte sich die Einführung daran anpassen. It is in English now, so. I would like to welcome you to the second lecture in our series on democracy and statehood. We are honored to have Professor Michael Freeden with us today. He will speak on the ideological transformation of British liberalism in the late 19th and early 20th century under the title British Liberalism and the State, the Emergence of a Fruitful Political and Intellectual Affinity. In this series of lectures, we hope to examine the state in its varying historical manifestations in Europe. In political theory, the state often is defined by its relationship to power, its expression in social and political institutions. Such an understanding of statehood, however, can obfuscate the fact that the state itself is a historically specific institution and that its forms, institutionalizations, and legitimizations vary greatly in history as well as in place. This is particularly evident in processes of transformation, of significant social and ideological change. An example of such a transformation we will hear about tonight. The transformation of the ideology of governance in Britain, liberalism, in the wake of the 20th century. In our last lecture in this series, we've heard about the Swedish state and its ability to mold and build Swedish society through its conception of a society as a homogeneous community. Today, we will be able to examine the historical emergence of a specific model of statehood in Britain. Specifically, we will hear about the ideological foundations that form the basis for the significant change which British statehood underwent in the early 20th century. If the state is a historically specific order, then its concrete forms, the reach of its power, and the scope of its transformational aspiration must be conceptualized, they must be argued for and legitimized. Therefore, we're very lucky to have with us tonight not only one of the foremost experts on British liberalism, an acute historian of actual political thinking, but also a theoretician of ideology as such. Michael Freeden was Professor of Politics at the University of Oxford. He was the director of the Centre of Political Ideologies at Oxford and the founding editor of the Journal of Political Ideologies. He's currently a professorial researcher at the University of London. In his 1978 book titled The New Liberalism, An Ideology of Social Reform, and his subsequent study, Liberalism Divided, Freeden upended a narrative about the decline of British liberalism in the 20th century. He showed its significant influence for the development of British politics in the 20th century. Both books were instantly understood as classics in their field. It would take too long here to list all the other significant books and publications which Michael Freeden has published in his academic career, but I want to mention here that Freeden has also developed an entirely new understanding of looking at political thinking as such in the 20th century. His work on ideology and on the theory of political thinking has challenged a consensus in which only those in the other political camp have an ideology. He has shown how ideology is the form our thinking takes about politics and how this is inevitable. It might be a painful insight, but particularly in our time, this insight is important if we want to understand the politics of our day. But now I will give the podium to Michael Freeden. We're very much looking forward to hearing from him and to hearing from his understanding of liberalism in the 20th century.
Well, thank you for your very...
Would you like to?
You want to? I can go, yes.
No, just as you like.
I can see you better that way. I'll go there. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. But I must take my water with me and my watch. Thank you. Very nice. So thank you very much for your very kind words. I'm very pleased to be here. I've been in Hamburg a few times, but never in an academic capacity, so that is nice. The famous economist John Maynard Keynes memorably wrote in 1926, and I quote, "Possibly the Liberal Party cannot serve the state in any better way than by supplying conservative governments with cabinets and Labour governments with ideas." And in that sentence, he intuitively identified both the central weakness and the central achievement of British liberalism at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. Its appeal to the left of the political spectrum, but its institutional incompetence in attaining liberal goals. On one dimension, that was the last major period of political success of the Liberal Party. It won famously the 1906 election in what was known as the Liberal Landslide, and it passed laws both in the social sphere and through the highly significant Parliament Act of 1911, which curtailed the veto powers of the House of Lords, but didn't quite eliminate them. But the story of liberalism is not to be confined to the party political sphere, but focuses on the rise of a political ideology known as the New Liberalism, and certainly not to be confused with the current neoliberalism. My first book that you mentioned earlier was recently translated into Mandarin, and it was initially banned by the censor because they couldn't distinguish between new liberalism and neoliberalism. They thought this would be a book on neoliberalism. It took half a year of negotiations between the publisher and the censor to get it published eventually. Just the title. The book was fine. In the larger historical perspective, the success of the new liberalism lay primarily in carving out a social democratic site. It was never identified as such in British political and ideological parlance, but a social democratic site that became crucial to the emergence of humanist, left-of-centre ideas and policies in 20th century Britain. And it thus crucially shifted the trajectory of liberalism, and that is the subject of my talk today. But that said, the flip side of this was that intellectual fashions, however illuminating, need to be translated into simple terms to arouse electoral interest, and that with the rise of organized labor, liberals were not the only ones competing over social policies that would attract the allegiance of the dispossessed and the marginalized. And it was also clear that liberals, and that has been their problem to this very day, lacked the emotional and populist appeal that mass politics was demanding and is demanding. The older roots of liberalism are to be found as a mainly defensive position of constructing constitutional and legal safeguards around individuals. And it arose from the desire to curb, to limit absolute rule by defining the limits of government, including the right to resist tyranny, and through establishing the rule of law and the sanctity of contracts. By locating natural rights in the individual, liberalism was the first system of political ideas to promote an anthropocentric view of society. From the 18th century onwards, liberalism added another project, that of human emancipation, identifying the individual as the core of productive energy that had to be unleashed, not only for personal advantage, but for the well-being of society as a whole, through introducing, in the 19th century, introducing the entrepreneur as the model of the good citizen. But that also helped to launch a radicalizing spirit in which political and social institutions were to be the subjects of continual reassessment and the targets of constant improvement based on the criterion of the utility they could bring to humankind. And both projects paved the path for liberalism's claim to have general appeal. And yet, if you adopt a historical rather than a philosophical viewpoint, liberalism is a parochial ideology, emerging from Western Europe, masquerading as a universal one. When I said this once to some political philosophers, in particular the American philosopher Ronald Dworkin, he was shocked beyond belief. But this is actually what is the case. It pretends to be universal, or it claims to be universal in philosophical terms. Of course, it comes from a very particular part of the planet to this very day. However, this parochial ideology masquerading as a universal one, of course, is a common feature that liberalism shares with Marxism. By the mid-19th century, philosophers such as John Stuart Mill, inspired among others by Alexander von Humboldt, had introduced a shift in perspective. From a belief system emphasizing the creation of spaces between individual and individual, which we call this a horizontal view, Mill elaborated a vertical theory of movement and change that was encapsulated in his famous phrase in Chapter 3 of On Liberty, the free development of individuality. These are three words of great importance: freedom, development, and individuality, and they are sort of a triangle that impact on each other. And through this triangle, people could grow their specific talents and skills to unlock human potential, to some extent also reflected in the German idea of Bildung. So liberalism now encouraged the cultivation of maturing and progressing individual, and from that time on it became a Weltanschauung and a program about the gradual but assured civilizing of societies over time, and history became the open-ended stage on which that would happen. That was the self-understanding of liberals in the mid and the second half of the 19th century. So the notion of human well-being as the main goal of social life alongside liberty became the most prominent liberal feature of the 20th century and the basis of the ideology of the welfare state. I'll come back to that. The reforming mood of liberalism had a significant impact on the restructuring of social relations through the demands of a rising middle class for a place in the political sun. And through Mill and other 19th century thinkers, liberalism emerged equipped with three key features: a sharp divide between public and private, a dynamic of change, and a growing sensitivity to the particular attributes of human beings as well as to their universal ones, to what makes them different as well as to what they share. But the human costs of the Industrial Revolution, and it was only understood by the end of the 19th century, proved to be devastating. Poverty, disease, unemployment, and squalid living conditions made a mockery of a free individual able to choose his or her path in life. And once the vote had been extended in the 1880s to many, though far from all, and the women, as you will know, were excluded until 1918, the condition of the working classes had become increasingly in plain sight and politically problematic. It was actually known as the condition of the people issue. Removing legal hindrances for people to pursue opportunities was meaningless, unless it was recognized that there were still economic and social hindrances or barriers that individuals simply could not overcome on their own. Private philanthropy, although very prominent in late Victorian society, could not cope with the scale of the problem. And it was feared to lack a broad overview, because philanthropy always favored some particular religious and cultural and moral concerns rather than others. And it was here that the strength of liberalism's adaptive powers came into play, building on new social understandings that emerged as the 19th century drew to a close. Liberalism was propelled by four underlying cultural and conceptual changes. First, the increasing acknowledgement of social interdependence as a structural inevitability. This is simply how societies are, as well as an enriching human resource. Second, the recognition that future time involved risks and uncertainties, and hence required planned anticipation, planned anticipatory responses that aimed, as far as it was possible, at partially controlling that risky future. influenced, among others, by the new actuarial technologies in the insurance industry. And third, a belief that democracy was endowed with mitigating and taming attributes. It could control and moderate what was happening in society, and then it could counterbalance the reductionist view of the state as an instrument only of external and sectional power. And fourth, the understanding that human societies were subject to laws of human evolution. And these transformations breathe discursive persuasiveness into the idea of welfare and to the ideational power of welfarism, I would call it. Those factors combined with a genuine concern with the plight and the misery of those who carried the heavy burdens of the Industrial Revolution on their shoulders, and the realization that an appeal to an active citizenship was a sine qua non of these new politics. So let me look at some of those themes in greater detail. State intervention became justified now, not only just to guarantee the more basic satisfaction of essential physical needs, but precisely in order to remove barriers to Mill's notion of the free development of individuality. The inevitability of the crisis of ill health, of unemployment, of ignorance, of poverty, that could strike so many during the course of their lifetime, could strike anybody, any one of us during our lifetimes, changed liberals' perceptions and interpretation of social activity and responsibility. And it now became acceptable, there was quite a revolution, to seek and give mutual assistance in an organized and efficient manner and without stigma. While earlier liberals, say in the mid-19th century, thought that people on the whole were self-reliant, they were capable of running their own lives, they were even assertive when it came to finance and industry, the new liberals incorporated within liberalism a very novel view of human interdependence that broke free from the atomistic models and replaced negative notions of intervention in private lives with positive and attractive notions of assistance in releasing trapped or impeded human potential. And new ideas emerging from psychology and from sociology suggested that human beings were existentially precarious entities, that human fragility and interdependence were normal rather than, as was believed in the mid-19th century, aberrations of character, something was wrong. No, it was human beings were, in a way, their fragility and frailness was an attractive part of being human. This aggressiveness and solidity of the mid-19th century was rejected in favor of a more humane understanding of individual personality. So an acknowledgement of the limits of human endeavor now replaced the unbounded scope of human ability that inspired Victorians. There was no end to what entrepreneurs and active citizens could do. And indeed, precisely because unlimited harm incurred by unlimited economic activity had been seen as an acceptable cost of the Industrial Revolution in the mid-19th century, liberals found that they had to shift the message of development to areas where there would be no lethal costs attached to competition. Competition was lethal in many ways for individuals, and it was trying to humanize competition as far as that is possible in the first place. So the new liberalism, in its day the most radical and progressive among the variants of British liberalism, actually to this day, not only in its day, was spearheaded not by the comfortable bourgeoisie or bankers or businessmen, but by conscientious professional groups, journalists and writers, progressive church people, municipal reformers, who expressed themselves through the press, through ethical societies, through political discussion groups, and through universities. Among them, maybe the most notable was Leonard Hobhouse, the social philosopher, and he was also the editorial writer of the Manchester Guardian for many, many years in his spare time. When I was working on my early book, I went to the archive of the Manchester Guardian in Manchester to try to identify the editorials that he wrote, and they are always unsigned. Most editorials in Britain are unsigned. But I looked at the accounts book, and you could see that Mr. Hobhouse was paid for 3 long editorials and 5 short editorials in March 1909 or whatever. And because I knew his style, it was actually quite easy to identify which ones he had written. This was an enormous additional resource in trying to... You have here a political philosopher who also deals with the day-to-day issues, and he bridged the gap in an extraordinary way, and it is really very, very important and illuminating for a scholar to be able to look at the way that more abstract theory is channeled and filtered through everyday events. In a notable passage, which expressed the best in the progressive liberal tradition, Hobson wrote, and I quote, Hobson, who was his, let me precede this, J. Hobson, Hobhouse and Hobson, which is sometimes a bit confusing, they were also great friends. Hobson was a journalist, he was an eminent critic of imperialism, he was quoted by Lenin, and he also was one of an economic theorist who was acknowledged by Keynes. And Hobson wrote as follows, and this is, I think, a very interesting passage. Liberalism is now formally committed to a task which certainly involves a new conception of the state in its relation to the individual life and to private enterprise. From the standpoint which best presents its continuity with earlier liberalism, it appears as a fuller appreciation and realization of individual liberty contained in the provision of equal opportunities for self-development. That is what gives people liberty. And then he adds, to this individual standpoint must be joined a just apprehension or appreciation of the social. That is, the insistence that the claims or rights of self-development of individuals be adjusted to the sovereignty of social welfare. And then he elaborated in an extraordinary sort of programmatic passage. It was about 1909 when he wrote this. Free land, free travel, free power, which means electric power, free credit, security, justice and education. No man is free for the full purposes of civilized life today unless he has all those liberties. And it's extraordinary program coming not from a committed hardcore socialist, but from a liberal. Hobhouse, Leonard Hobhouse, was the author of what I think is the most powerful modern plaidoyer of liberalism, his brilliant and lucid book called Liberalism, published in 1911. Has it been translated into German? Probably not. No? It has been translated. I mean, most Germans read English, so there's no problem, but it's been translated into many languages. Maybe it should be translated into German as well one day. Anyhow, that's not important. And he writes, in an incisive sentence, or 2 sentences, mutual aid is not less important than mutual forbearance. I mean, to refrain from doing something. Aid and forbearance. The theory of collective action no less fundamental than the theory of personal freedom. So in elevating liberty and welfare to twin liberal ends, the new liberals welcomed a degree of state intervention in individual lives and provided only that such intervention still served self-development. It had to be state intervention for a reason. Self-development, the furtherance of a rational common good, and a humanist conception of well-being. The welfare state then was the political manifestation of those left liberal tendencies, and the liberalism that sustained it has been, or more accurately, I'm afraid, used to be, one of Britain's most significant ideational exports, together with Scandinavia. And there's an interesting link between many of the new liberals and some of the Swedish social reformers in the early part of the 20th century. it's also difficult to appreciate, I mentioned evolution a few moments ago, to appreciate the pervasive power of Darwinist evolutionary theories at the time, in biology, in literature, in social philosophy. At the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, there was an explosion of thinking on Darwinist lines. But it's not the struggle for survival or the survival of the fittest version of Darwinism. It is the cooperation version of Darwinism. So contrary to the social Darwinist theories that identified a brutal struggle for survival as a law that even human beings could not escape, Hobhouse insisted that the evolutionary process, demonstrated through the study of biology and psychology — he spent many, many weeks in the zoo at Manchester observing primates, observing advanced apes, and was replacing, he argued, competition with intelligent cooperation. So the struggle version is the more famous one of the two, but it's not the more influential one of the two. There's a much more important — the struggle for survival was always sort of a rather right-wing view of the world, which actually did not carry into mainstream center and left-of-center political thinking. But Darwinism as cooperation did. So Hobhouse consolidated his view that social life was a product of a purposive rationality and affirmed a threefold message concerning his master concept of evolution. Progress was teleological in its nature. It was typified by the expanding role accorded to human rationality, and its impact was also measured by an increasing ethical relationship among human beings. And Hobhouse directed these evolutionary insights to political ends by identifying the state as the guiding benevolent agency that induced increased social rationality. It had a purpose, the state. A sense of a joint ethical enterprise, which entailed the redistribution of life chances in order to optimize opportunities for individual development and harmonize potentially conflicting human ends, and that was linked to advanced policies of social reform. And hence, interestingly enough, not only the individuals, but the community itself was a rights bearer. The community too had rights. Not against the individual, but in cooperation with the individual. There were things that only communities could do, and they had to have the space and the guarantees to be able to do that. Nevertheless, individual rights and the development of individual personality were essential to the health of the social whole, in line with a rather organic interconnection of the parts of a society. And Hobson, even more than his friend Hobhouse, held to a very strong theory of the organic structure of society. Because usually when you have organic theories, it means the whole is more important than the parts. We can sacrifice this or that part in order to maintain the whole. They reversed this by saying, like in a body, if any part is ill, if any part is diseased, the entire body atrophies, the entire body gets ill. And so you have to promote and protect the rights of every individual in order to have a healthy society. So individuals needed to be cultivated and to develop not only for their own sakes, but for the sake of society itself. Society was dependent and a beneficiary of individual development. And this, one might say, vitalism, celebrated by some of those new liberals, mirrored a developing theme among a number of continental thinkers who were related to the exercise of dynamic biological and spiritual energy. Dilthey, Bergson, and so on. And that became a partial, not entirely successful attempt to de-intellectualize liberalism and make it more scientific rather than more philosophical, rather than the previously more abstract moral and ideational notions that liberalism maintained. So if creativity was normal, if sociability was normal, then it was in that area that the new liberalism was able to impart this message of liberal humanism, to replace that of human competitiveness, and this message of sociability and community replaced that of the desirably rigid division between public and private, which is beginning to break down by the beginning of the 20th century in liberal thinking. The major reforms of liberal government between 1908 and 1911 should be seen in that light. Years of public debate on old age pensions culminated in legislation in 1908, but every effort was made in Britain, every effort was made to distinguish that kind of state pension from the pioneering state insurance initiated by Bismarck 20 years earlier. The British interpretation of Bismarck, I'm not saying this is right or wrong, I'm just explaining this, was of a system intended to ensure social stability. But the new liberals, to the contrary, saw pensions as having to do with social justice and the reward for social service during a working person's life. At that time, only men, I'm afraid, so it was working men. It was only those in the poorer sections of society. So old age pensions were not universal as originally hoped for, but were hailed as a first step towards attaining a minimum standard of life. And then you got further legislation in 1911. I'm saying this because this is actually the real precursor of the welfare legislation of the post-Second World War period. An extraordinary period between 1908 and 1911, which was an unleashing of this kind of legislation, which then the Labour Party picked up after 1945. And the Labour Party, of course, said this is a Labour idea, but if you look at the history of it, it really comes from liberal sources. So we had health and unemployment insurance, and these were the early forerunners of the welfare legislation in 1948. And seen in that light, health and unemployment insurance were not only devices to make private lives tolerable, but to guarantee the health of a liberal society. It's amusing, incidentally, to note that in a 1912 pamphlet of the Liberal Publication Department, it was titled, "Compulsion Means Simply a Larger Freedom," in sort of quasi-Hegelian tones, but I don't think that this viewpoint was generally adopted. I mean, this is a bit over the top as far as liberalism was concerned. But here in a nutshell was the ideology of the welfare state. The new liberals' greatest, and despite the benefit of hindsight, most enduring creation. So now let me turn to some of the problems. Because while the new liberals were captivated by their own vision of a fair and cohesive society, that variety was not preparing liberalism for all its future 20th century challenges. To begin with, there are many liberalisms even within the same cultural community, let alone across countries. You know, if it weren't so difficult and cumbersome, I would never talk of liberalism. I'd always talk about liberalisms and socialisms and conservatisms in the plural. They've got some family resemblances, but there are really very many different varieties within each such family. So some of the liberals who were not able to retain the allegiance of the free marketeers, who increasingly migrated to the Conservative Party. There was a beginning of a split here already, which guaranteed the Tories, the Conservatives, a new lease of life. And they weren't able to offer solutions to economic stability before Keynes, himself in many senses remote from the new liberals. He's often been co-opted as one of the new liberals, but if you look at the small print, he is not. And no less significantly, the new liberals underestimated the appeal of socialism, even in its non-revolutionary form in the United Kingdom. And in particular, they underestimated social democracy. And the irony is, of course, that the neoliberalism is almost indistinguishable from Scandinavian social democracy, except that the words, people in one country don't like the words of the other. The word liberal is not a happy word in Scandinavia, where it is right of center, and here too, and in France. Whereas in Britain, the word social democracy was not a very attractive word either. But when you look at when you read it at what they actually are talking about, 80% overlap. Because political labels are crucial in the marketplace of political competitiveness. And it's often the labels, misleading as they are, that have enormous impact on people's perception of what those labels stand for. And liberals have always been bad at popular support. Liberals don't sing. Yeah, you have the Internationale, I mean, the Nazis had the Horse Wessellied. Liberals don't sing. This is interesting that liberals don't sing. Not even when their messages are intended to appeal to the heart, they are addressed to the head. And in a world of fast food, slow cooking doesn't satisfy short-term hunger. And there were other shortcomings. To the extent that neoliberals were critical about empire, they were critical about the exploitation of the labor and resources of other nations, but they were not critical about the desire of the colonizers to impose a British liberal model on indigenous societies. That was still part of this notion of this unitary evolution towards greater civilization that would encompass the entire planet. And in a tone not dissimilar to Habermas's notion of Verfassungspatriotismus, constitutional patriotism, Hobhouse offered the principle of citizenship as a unifying, vital, and organic social bond, noting, and I quote, "The characteristic modern state exhibits the most complete reconciliation yet achieved on the large scale of social cooperation with the freedom and spontaneity of the competent individual, localities, and nationalities." But what was then beyond the imagination of the new liberals, and even exaggerated by them because of their profound belief in the rational harmony of responsible individuals, was a possibility of strongly diverging lifestyles inside the community, whether of gender, or ethnicity, or of religion. So the idea of the state in the hands of the new liberals underwent a remarkable metamorphosis. Consider the options already at play when they arrived on the scene. You have the ancient role of the state as an apparatus for raising taxes and recruiting soldiers. You have the state as a punitive organization designed to maintain social control or law and order. And you have the state as a means of class oppression. These are three of the major views of the state that were circulating by the second half of the 19th century. Now, earlier liberals, and what I call proto-liberals, because technically speaking, liberalism only began as a theory in about 1812. The word was first used in Spain just before the final Napoleonic Wars. Earlier liberals and proto-liberals had drawn up rules for restricting the capacity of the state to damage those inside its territory. They demanded justification for exercising authority, and they permitted arbitrary rulers to be overthrown. And in parallel, they delineated the realm of civil society. They prescribed the rules of social cooperation and of property ownership at a time when sufficient private property was, of course, the preserve of very few people. And they introduced embryonic notions of political consent that rendered government conditional and contractual, not absolute. But here was something new. And the new thing, the new addition to all those understandings of the state, was that the state was now also an enabler and a nourisher of human potential, an institution that should be welcomed, not feared. It was now a distributor of social well-being. It was a guardian of human interests. And a well-known liberal weekly published an article in 1912 entitled, I think it's really a very good title, "The Claim for a Share in Life." Everybody is entitled to a share in life. And it's a responsibility, among others, of the state to make this possible. Not to enforce it on individuals, but to make it possible. And that was what the state, in partnership with others, was expected to deliver. Those who complained about the specter of an intrusive and debilitating nanny state misunderstood the intentions of the new liberals. Not to create a paternalistic or maternalistic provider and director, but to remove economic, political, and social hindrances, as well as to give people at the bottom of the ladder a foot up. And that was later reflected in the famous Beveridge report of 1942, still in the middle of the war, that prefigured the post-World War II welfare state, when Beveridge talked about retaining incentive, opportunity, and responsibility as part of collective social policy. So how did the new liberals propose to tame the state? And here a combination of idealism, naivete, and optimism combined to produce a new model of state conduct. And those were grounded on at least three factors: a strong commitment to human rationality and the attraction of altruism, an unremitting faith in progress, and the postulation of a unified community. And I'll come back to this in a moment. Vesting their hopes in the spread of education, the new liberals envisaged an enlightened and reasonable society that would heed expert advice and be open to the best scientific findings and deliberate practices of the times. And the assumption of the continuous improvement of the quality of life was almost taken for granted. It's striking in its contrast with the deep pessimism now typical of the human outlook. The idea of a single, cohesive community driven by the same ideals and purposes was the most remarkable, perhaps the most innocent of the three. And here the new liberals papered over a crack that was emerging in liberal thought and practice. They still regarded liberalism as a grand unifying theory that was simply the expression of a universal ethics, even though that unity was not the product of human agency as much as a product of a particular view of social harmony. So liberals thought that reasonable individuals would conform to a homogeneous model of human virtue. Even though Hobson had allowed for play and for error in human conduct, echoing Mill's approval of eccentricity of eccentric individuals, human variety was conceived of as beneficial only when it was not focused on the fundamentals of social life and cooperation. And that concern, if we now move to the recent past, became evident in the third of the 20th century, when liberalism had to incorporate the reality not of a unified group, which was its guiding idea, but of multiple, plural groups, ethnicities, and cultures that constituted a society. And the breakthrough from the liberal viewpoint was a discarding of the homogeneous nation-state or the regionally composite nation-state and offering a fresh formula, an acceptance that the days of centralized singularity of a society were over, if indeed they'd ever existed, and that the coexistence of numerous socio-political entities with their own customs, with their own characteristics, could be part of the liberal experience. There had, of course, been older forms of ethnic pluralism that practiced a degree of mutual toleration, such as in the Habsburg territories, but that was under an empire, not a nation-state. Whereas liberalism had to struggle against other ideologies once its impact began to weaken in the middle of the clash of the extreme ideology in the 20th century, it now, and it was difficult for it to do so, to incorporate communal dissent and disagreement within its own understanding of the nature of liberalism itself, instead of this Darwinian notion of increasing evolutionary cooperation. So it now accepted that group diversity was of the same nature as individual diversity. But the problem for liberals was and is that on the whole, the crucial liberal feature of free choice becomes complex and becomes blurred. Ethnic and religious groups do not, as a rule, interpret their identity as a matter of choice. And some cultural groups can hold views substantially at odds with liberal fundamentals. So the challenge to liberals in containing their pluralism within what they still see as a field of universal values and norms has been threefold. First, how to manage a reasonable and constrained relativism that accepts a number of ways of life, and not all of them, of course. Second, how to arrange for incompatible values to coexist, which is easier said than done. And third, whether to tolerate illiberal practices that a group in the midst of a liberal society accepts as necessary for their lifestyle. So the multi-ethnicity that we now know was a game changer for liberal thinking, as in some of its forms it confronted liberals with a profound dilemma, how to handle groups in their midst who were not interested in practicing some of the core values that defined liberalism, that singled it out for what it was. And I can give as an example, I mean, it's an example we all know for the past 20 years, which is the wearing of headscarves. It's an excellent argument of how you can argue either side of the case as a liberal. That's the interesting thing about it. But you can't argue both sides at the same time as a liberal. So if you're a liberal who believes in the universality of human rights, you may regard the bestowing of special rights on particular religious groups as an infringement of the universal equality principle which is inherent to liberalism. But if you are a liberal who wishes to respect the particularity of individual and group lifestyles, you will regard the imposition of universal rules as a suppression of the uniqueness of human practices and of the group right to own them. And hence, as we all know, you can be a liberal who objects to Muslim women wearing headscarves in public, because you might consider that to be a form of illiberal oppression of women in male-dominated by male-dominated creeds and customs, or perhaps because it may simply expose vulnerable minorities to harm and abuse when they move in public places. Or you can be a liberal who supports the wearing of headscarves, because to ban them is an illiberal form of coercion that undermines group identity and the right of people to free expression, to make their own sartorial choices, to have their own choices about what they want to wear. Now, the problem is that both of those are liberal positions. Both of those are intensely felt and argued liberal positions, but you cannot, as I said a moment ago, you can't hold to both of them at the same time. And that's not atypical now of the divides, of the breaks, of the fissures, the cracks that begin to develop in liberal thinking. I'm almost ready. Okay? Yeah. Now, the new liberals would have been perplexed by these contemporary dilemmas. They would have scratched their head, because they assumed that rational contemplation and the prioritization of comprehensive community purposes were above all. They were the most important thing. They were paramount. And because they were reluctant to recognize intermediate groups between the individual and the state, because they considered the state to be the protector of all interests. So when, after the First World War, liberals turned their attention to the question of groups, they looked only at economic groups under the influence of guild socialism and syndicalism, ideologies that regarded individuals primarily as economic producers. What they were as yet unable to conceptualize was the importance people ascribed not to economic groups, but to cultural groups as shapers of their identity. And that later realization has threatened to create another crack in the liberal view of the world. I return now to the new liberal belief that democracy was endowed with taming and mitigating attributes. Unfortunately, the great hopes that the new liberals invested in developing an advanced welfare state were accompanied by what turned out to be grand illusions. The gradual democratization of Western societies had held out the prospect of a benevolent state, answerable to its members and sensitive to their needs. And the language began to change. The language of state activity began to soften as the 19th century ends and 20th century begins. The earlier term state interference, which indicates dislocation of normal processes and practices, gave way to state intervention. Interference is harder and more disruptive than just intervention, because intervention implied at least sorting out a problem. And the even later phrases were regulation and enablement. So there's a gradual pattern of replacing harsher words with more inclusive and softer words. And that crescendo of warming to the state, of having a warmer feeling towards the state, it was based on a democracy that would minimize the gap between rulers and ruled, with the state becoming an organ of social self-government, drawing in civil society as a friendly co-partner. But the inclusion of the state in that vision actually piled up future problems and false expectations, overestimating the convergence of a rational and ethically popular will. The same democratic participation that was essential to tailoring welfare requirements to actual needs also opened up a diversity of social fantasies about welfare, positive and negative, that was likely to become increasingly problematic. Paradoxically, the very democratization of societies that initially alerted them to the severe problem of social diswelfare also legitimated disagreement about social ends, including about welfare ends, and encouraged the expression of conflicting demands and of dissent that pluralism began in its wake. So if the theory of welfare is more or less a unified theory based on social and philosophical and also quasi-scientific evidence, the fact that people actually had different visions of what welfare was undermined this unity that the new liberals 100 years ago were so insistent about. And the upshot was the emergence of two democratic dilemmas. The first was potentially disruptive. Put bluntly, if welfarism was an ideology of the center-left, there was no reason to expect that the legitimate democratic system, with a normal spread of ideological positions, would inevitably maintain allegiance to welfare ideals. Why should? If you vote on these things, why should we assume that the center-left view of welfare will prevail? Only a false conception of welfare that permanently ranked it at the top of social priorities could have survived the unavoidable precariousness of political contingencies. And that naivete was indeed evident among the early welfare visionaries, but was incompatible with another supreme 20th century value from which welfarism itself arose, respect for the indeterminacy of the democratic process, the openness of the democratic process. So the seeds of future crisis were contained in a clash between the rosy belief in the rational singular integrity of social visions and policy and the fundamental misunderstanding and misconstrual of the heterogeneity and disruptiveness of democracy, with its periodical rejections of altruism and inclusiveness. The second democratic dilemma was the need to maintain expertise. Who knows? Who advises? Who decides? What constitutes a repository of knowledge? And regularly liberal paternalistic undertones crept into the debates, already 100 years ago, and the democratic gap persisted. So early welfare thinkers recognized, and I quote, "The present movement for social reform springs from above rather than from below." And if you look at the reforms, that's true also of European socialism in the late 19th, early 20th century. All the leaders of the socialists were middle-class people. There were very, very few, actually, from the working class themselves. The British social reformer Charles Masterman referred to the settlement movement. There was a movement in the early 20th century which graduates from Oxford and Cambridge, when they finished their studies, they went to they spent 6 months or so in the East End of London among the poor and tried to do good deeds. Masterman referred to this settlement movement, and I say this with some personal embarrassment. I quote him, designed to place the culture and intellect of Oxford and Cambridge at the service of the poor and ignorant. You can see the problem here. So liberals were hardly immune from those forms of paternalism, drawing their ideology away from egalitarianism. Indeed, no welfare project can avoid it entirely, because welfare is based on certain kinds of expert knowledge. And so this anti-expertise movements that we have in Brexit, that we have with the whole Rust Belt and Trump phenomenon is understandable, but you cannot run a society without experts, in some technical sense, experts. Not everybody can be a brain surgeon, or you can't be one on every third Tuesday and then do something else, which was the Marxist view of the rotation of positions. So I'm finishing now. Make no mistake, liberalism is one of the most central and pervasive political theories and ideologies, despite that it has been attacked from the left and from the right, and despite its appropriation by other creeds, by other beliefs. In fact, one of liberalism's more notable successes is that it has been quietly permeating some of its features into other ideological families. Its history carries a crucial heritage of civilized thinking, of political practices, and of philosophical, ethical creativity. You will find both in some forms of conservatism and in some forms of social democracy and in some forms of green political thought, fundamental liberal ideas. And without it, one could not conceive of the modern state that places the good of individuals before that of rulers. But liberalism achieved more than that. It has also, in recent times, upheld the concern for the welfare of others, and it has even more recently, as I suggested, begun to insist on sensitivity to social differences within a society. And within that narrative, the new liberalism produced an enticing cocktail of voluntarism, choice, agency, self-development, communal responsibility, and open-mindedness. And there was much robustness in those interlocking ideas. And there's even something we might cautiously call, at least structurally, a liberal dogmatism. Like any political ideology, like any political theory, liberalism possesses red lines it will not cross and non-negotiable principles over which it will not bargain. The primacy of liberty, the sanctity of constitutional arrangements, an attachment to basic human rights, a revulsion from torture and the death penalty, and for some, the insistence on respect for redistributive social justice and social exclusiveness. And all this, and perhaps the latter in particular, have been liberalism's legacy, augmented and humanized by the new liberalism. Thank you.